Ideas of a discussion that we were having this morning related to body fat percentage. And so I wanted to run through the value of a low carbohydrate diet. I think if you've read any of the paleo books, you understand that low carbohydrate diets address inflammation, specifically chronic inflammation if you're very overweight, and so it allows you to clear a lot of that fluid. And ends up being somewhat positive, and as long as you're in a calorie deficit, you'll often end up losing some amount of fat, or you could at least lose some amount of fat. The problem that you run into is if you get too aggressive there. In terms of high carbohydrate diets at a caloric deficit, the problem that you run into is that you can't eat at a high enough calorie figure to keep your other nutrients at a adequate amount. So your protein levels and your fat levels don't end up being favorable, and those can lead to long-term problems. In the end, your muscles are still full and hydrated, but you're sort of missing out on a lot of the other nutrients that you need for your body to function well. Whichever approach that you're going to take, though, is going to ultimately rob you of either energy or hydration, and so you're going to compromise something as you are dieting down related to body fat. So basically, if, for instance, let's say that you were at 26% and you were supposed to be at 2,700 calories, and then now you're eating at 1,900 calories for a long period of time, you pretty much are using your trump card to get to that lower percentage level. And so what ends up happening is you really only have two options at that point. You can increase your activity level, which is sort of difficult to do because you either don't have well hydrated muscles, or you aren't intaking adequate energy to adjust for your level of activity. Some of this is obviously a little different when you're carrying a lot of fat, because that will protect your muscle. But even in that instance, we suggest a more gradual approach, because in general you want to work out where you're feeling as close to 100% as possible. If you're eating adequate calories for a prolonged period of time, it is favorable as it relates to muscle maintenance and muscle retention. Part of the reason is because it allows for better hormonal function. Of course, you're being fed, you feel happy, your rest is better, and so that's a big basis for what we teach through both metabolic flexibility and Eat to Perform. Certainly you can do metabolic flexibility for high-intensity athletes at a lower calorie point, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the next few bullet points. But in general, you're trying to keep your activity level high most of the time, and then kind of addressing some of that later. If you're coming from a low carbohydrate or low calorie way of eating, you'll often gain weight as your muscles rehydrate and you become more functional. And so a lot of people get fearful that this relates to higher body fat levels, because they assumed that their lost weight previously was mostly fat, when in fact, if they were to test it, what they would find is that a lot of that stress caused hyper cortisol levels, things of that nature, and wasn't super favorable as it relates to muscle retention. And so, refilling those muscles often doesn't end up being, you won't end up adding a lot of body fat as a result. Now, one of the things I will caution people on is that as you start to gain weight, you just want to gain a small amount of weight. You don't want to put yourself in a position where you're gaining 10, 15, 20 pounds unless of course that's your goal. I mean, you know, we're obviously talking to many different audiences at this point, and so everybody's kind of has to look at what is their current situation. But specifically, I'm talking about someone who maybe went from 26% down to 20% and addressing that situation. When you're losing fat the right way, requires you to kind of view the way that you view yourself differently, because a lot of people go into this situation and think, well, I need to lose 20 pounds. You don't necessarily need to lose 20 pounds. In fact, a lot of people will look at a body fat test and go, okay, I weigh 200 pounds. I need to get from 20 to 15, so they do the math and they go, okay, 5% is 10 pounds. If I lose 10 pounds, I'll lose 10 pounds of fat. And so they do the math on the calories, they lower their calories to that amount, and it doesn't end up working out that way. And one of the reasons why it doesn't end up working out that way is because when you change things in a super dramatic way, it really affects everything. And so that's why a little bit more of a gradual approach, but really having a lot of days where you are eating at maintenance, and potentially actually even gaining a little weight ends up being real favorable for long-term fat loss. So the last thing I'm going to point out is that I use typically a 3-month kind of reset for people that are in this situation. So let's say that you've gone from 26% to say 20%. Let's go ahead and use about 3 months. You might actually gain a few pounds as you start adding water back into your muscles. And then you're going to want to really work up your work capacity while you're fed. And so you really want to get stronger at this point. You want to make sure that you're really pushing things as it relates to your energy output. You've got more energy coming in, so therefore you should be able to do more in the gym. And like I said, don't let it get too out of hand, because then it becomes real difficult and you can add fat at that point. But I wouldn't be overly concerned about adding fat. I don't think that that's going to be the biggest concern. I think a lot of people look at being 26% or 20% or 14% as if it's like a death sentence. It's not that extreme. So I really would think that if you can put performance first as your goal, that's going to end up long term with you sort of getting where you want naturally, rather than you constantly try and force the issue. So once again, everyone's different. You may have to make some changes that are outside of the box of what I'm talking about here, but in general, I think you'll find this to be good advice. Thanks.